He was a man consumed by the mistakes of his past, condemned and imprisoned for his choices. But when freedom finally gave him a new chance, Dylan not only fought to rebuild his life, he became the last hope for young people on the brink. But can he, an ex-convict, truly change the fate of those who could one day be like him? Or could the weight of his past still bring him down? Prepare yourself for a story of resilience, redemption, and the tireless fight for a better future. When we look at someone like Dylan, it's easy to judge by his appearance or the choices he made in the past. But what many don't realize is that every mistake has a story behind it, and every life, no matter how irreversible it may seem, carries moments of pain, struggle, and an almost unbearable desire to be something different. Dylan wasn't born into a world of opportunity. In fact, he was born into an environment where making the wrong choices seemed like the only way out. His life didn't begin with crime or prison, but with trying to survive in a world where survival often meant taking the easiest, and often the darkest path. Dylan grew up in a neighborhood marked by poverty, violence, and a lack of prospects. From a young age, he saw what was happening to the people around him: families torn apart by drugs, violence, and a lack of access to education or any kind of support. Dreams, if any, were quickly crushed by harsh reality. The first time Dylan got involved in crime was not by choice, but by necessity. When you're a child and see your friends and even family members involved in the drug trade, the pressure to fit in becomes unbearable. At first, it seemed harmless. It was just a way to make a quick buck, to cope in a world that offered nothing but hardship. The influence of those around Dylan had a huge impact on his trajectory. He wasn't the only one affected. Most of his friends were in the same situation. Growing up watching adults who had become slaves to the system or addiction was the norm. There were no examples of positive figures, of people who fought for life honestly, without resorting to violence or crime. Like any young person searching for their place in the world, Dylan tried to find a way to stand out, to feel powerful, to be respected. And crime was the path he chose. He started with petty theft, but soon delved into riskier activities. Little by little, he distanced himself from the few values he still had and moved closer to a lifestyle that took him further and further away from what could have been a normal life. He fell in with dangerous people, surrounded himself with associates who had only one thing in mind: quick profit, without regard for the consequences. It was in this chaotic environment that he made the mistakes that would land him in prison. And with each step, Dylan felt more trapped, not only physically, but emotionally. The weight of guilt began to accumulate, but at that moment, he didn't know how to break out of this cycle. The idea that he could change his life seemed distant, almost impossible. Society, for him, was far from fair, and prison, which at the time seemed like punishment, would later become an opportunity, a chance for reflection and eventually redemption. But to get there, Dylan had to lose a lot. Prison was the ultimate consequence of his actions. There, he was brutally confronted with the reality of his mistakes. However, contrary to what many might expect, this wasn't the hardest part of his life. The hardest part was realizing that he himself had become a hostage to his choices. He was trapped not only by the bars, but by the very mindset he had created over the years. When the prison doors closed behind Dylan, he finally had the space he needed to stop and reflect on what he had become, and what, if possible, he could become. This time behind bars wasn't just punishment, it was the key to transformation. His time there was marked by moments of solitude, but also of intense introspection. Dylan had to face his own ghosts, the people he hurt, the lives he destroyed, the opportunities he squandered. He began to realize that, as much as the system had failed him, the greatest failure had been his own. He had chosen the easy path, the path of crime, thinking it would make him strong, but in reality, it weakened him. When the moment of his release finally arrived, he knew his life would never be the same. Freedom didn't just mean being out of jail. It meant having a chance to rebuild everything he had destroyed, not only in his own life, but also in the lives of those he had influenced along the way. Now, with a new perspective on his own existence, Dylan knew he needed to use what he had learned in prison to help others avoid following his own path. But before trying to change someone else's life, he had to first change his own. And that would be the biggest battle of all. If you were touched by this story and want to follow Dylan's journey towards redemption, leave your like now. Don't forget to subscribe on the channel so you don't miss any chapter of this exciting transformation. Let's discover together how, even at rock bottom, life can give you a second chance. You too can make a difference in someone's life. The metallic sound of the door closing echoed like thunder in Dylan's chest. It was the sound he knew would define his life from then on. He felt a wave of helplessness, mixed with visceral anger at himself, but also a strange sense of relief. He no longer needed to run. Now he was trapped. But somewhere, deep down, he knew this was where he would finally have to face reality. And that reality was anything but sweet. In the early days, Dylan clung to what he knew. The pride, the toughness, the need to be unbeatable, as if prison were just another part of the game. He thought that maybe, if he were strong enough, he could do things his way, keep his facade intact. But soon, the weight of the walls began to suffocate him. It wasn't just the bars that imprisoned him, but the deafening silence of reflection. He was there, surrounded by men who, like him, had been swallowed by their own choices. Each carried their own story, their own ghosts, and Dylan began to realize that the system he had defied so many times wasn't the greatest enemy. The real enemy was within himself. As the days dragged on, the forced solitude gave way to something he'd never had before. Time. Time to think. Time to remember the wrong choices that had brought him here. He could no longer hide, no longer blame the system, society, or the people around him. He had to look at himself, and that was more painful than any blow he'd ever suffered. Little by little, memories began to flood his mind. The desperate look of the mother of the friend he'd sold out, the scream of the wife of a man he'd hurt, the sad smile of a child he'd never seen but knew he'd destroyed by ruining his father's future. And these images, these voices, began to torment Dylan like a relentless storm. He didn't know how to deal with it. At first, he tried to convince himself he was still the same man. But over time, he began to realize he wasn't. He was no longer the tough guy, the street boss, the one who controlled everything and everyone. He was just a man, naked in his flaws, his fears, and most importantly, his choices. When night fell, and he found himself alone in his cell, he could no longer escape the truth. The face in the mirror, the one he still couldn't recognize, showed the pain of a man who couldn't forgive himself. Dylan began to experience loneliness in a whole new way. He was not only physically isolated from others, but he felt disconnected from his own humanity. There were no more masks, no more stories to tell, just him and the echoes of his failures. It was in this emptiness that he began to confront his deepest demons. The man he wanted to forget, the man who made mistakes, who lied and destroyed lives, now stood before him, naked and exposed. There was no longer any hiding from the guilt. Over time, the reflections became heavier, and Dylan found himself talking to a version of himself he had suppressed for years. He wondered how he had gotten here. How had he allowed moments of anger, of wrong choices, of pride to carry him so far? When he looked at himself, he no longer saw that young man full of dreams. Only a man without a future, without purpose. The man he had been, and the man he had become, no longer fit together. It was as if two versions of himself were in constant war. With each passing day, Dylan found himself more deeply involved in a painful but necessary process, confronting his own reflection. He could no longer blame society or circumstances. He was responsible for the choices he had made, and that man he had tried so hard to ignore was now screaming to be heard. The flaws, the mistakes, the people he had hurt, all of it haunted him unbearably. And even if he wanted to hide, there was no escape. The prison at that moment wasn't just a physical place. It was the prison of his conscience, the weight of guilt that crushed him with each passing day. As the weeks passed, an idea began to stir within him, a timid spark of something he had never considered before. Maybe it would be possible to change. But how? How could he repair the lives he had destroyed? How could he regain his own humanity? He didn't know, but the feeling that he should try was taking hold of him. And for the first time in a long time, Dylan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The hope that maybe there was a way out. Maybe the man he had been didn't need to define who he would be. Prison, which had previously seemed like an endless punishment, gradually became a space for transformation. Dylan began to see suffering as something that, if he knew how to deal with it, could serve as a key to his change. But to do so, he would first need to accept who he was and what he had done. Accept his responsibility without further excuses or justifications. And each day, he took a small step toward finding something he had never imagined. True freedom, which could only come through forgiveness, starting with himself. But what Dylan didn't know was that the greatest challenge was yet to come. Because after facing his own demons, he would have to decide whether he wanted to move forward or remain a prisoner of the past. When the prison doors finally opened, the sound wasn't the same as the first time. It wasn't the metallic clang that had previously signaled only the separation between Dylan and the outside world. Now, the doors weren't just bars. They were portals to a new reality, a new life, but also a great heavy burden of uncertainty. Dylan felt freedom in his body, but the sensation didn't come with the relief he'd imagined. It was more a feeling of being adrift, in a vast, unknown sea, unsure if he could swim. The first steps out of the prison were unsteady. The cool wind blew against his face, but the air felt strange, as if he were trying to adjust to something he'd never truly felt. The world outside, which had once seemed so simple and familiar, now felt like an unforgiving jungle. The streets, the cars, the people, everything seemed distant, unrecognizable. Dylan didn't know what to make of his freedom. In prison, everything was predetermined. When he woke up, when he ate, when he worked. Outside, he no longer had control. The first few days were a whirlwind of conflicting feelings. He was free, but the weight of his past seemed to cling to him like a relentless shadow. Every step outside the prison was a reminder that he was no longer the man who entered. He tried to adapt, to find a job, but the stigma of being an ex-con followed him every time the door closed in his face. The opportunities he so desperately desired were scarce, and with every no, every suspicious look from others, Dylan felt as if he were being pushed back down the path of despair and loneliness that had led him to prison. Society wasn't kind to those trying to reintegrate. The closed doors weren't just for jobs. They symbolized isolation, judgment, and doubt that someone like Dylan could truly change. He felt that, even though he'd done the hardest work within himself, there was still something insurmountable between him and others. An invisible wall of distrust and fear. He wasn't that criminal anymore, but it seemed no one wanted to give him a chance to show it. There were no welcome letters, no applause, just curious looks and silent questions. Will he ever be the same again? But what struck him most was the difficulty of starting over. When he looked around, he realized how much the world had changed while he was behind bars. People moved on with their lives, their routines, and he felt increasingly like an outsider, like a ghost still trying to fit into a world that had forgotten him. Even his family, who had drifted away the moment he was arrested, felt distant. The bonds were broken, and when he tried to reach out, he felt his words were no longer enough to regain the trust he had lost. What he had done, the mistakes he had made, could not be erased with simple apologies or promises. However, amidst this whirlwind of frustration and rejection, something unexpected happened. Dylan wasn't sure if it was perseverance or the urge of desperation, but he didn't give up. He sought shelter in a reintegration center, where he began meeting other ex-convicts, people who, like him, were trying to rebuild their lives. There, he realized he wasn't alone. He began to see that many people had gone through similar journeys, and, more importantly, that there was no single path to redemption. Each had a unique story, but they were all searching, just like him, for something that would make them feel human again. It was in this place that Dylan had his true 12th chance. There, he began to realize that freedom wasn't just a matter of being outside the prison walls. True freedom came from within, from not allowing the past to continue to control one's actions, from not being a prisoner of one's own fears and failures. He began to understand that reintegration wouldn't be an easy journey, but that each step was important. And deep down, the pain of being rejected by others could no longer be greater than the pain of not trying. It was when he began to actively engage with others, sharing his experiences and helping those who were also trying to rebuild their lives, that Dylan realized something important. Perhaps the best way to heal himself wasn't just to find a job or become accepted by society again, but to help others avoid making the same mistakes he had made. Every gesture of help, every young person he saw trying to take a step in the right direction, was a reminder that, even after the darkest of pasts, there was still value in his life. True victory wouldn't be acceptance by society, but acceptance of himself. True freedom wasn't freedom from the system, but freedom from the burden of one's own regrets. And now, with this new vision, Dylan knew his path was no longer in his own hands. He knew his mission was just beginning. Dylan never imagined that true transformation in his life would come through others. When he began working at a reintegration center for at-risk youth, his goal was simple: to try to help in some way, to offer what he had learned, and perhaps, in some way, seek his own healing. He knew it was risky, that many of these young people were on the same path he had been on years ago. But still, he felt this was the only way he could truly contribute something positive. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had once been a negative example was now trying to be a guide, a model for change. When Dylan first walked into the room full of young people, one thing was immediately clear. They didn't want to hear about an ex-con. They saw him as just another person who talked about redemption and opportunities, without understanding what it was like to live on the margins of society, without knowing what it was like to grow up in an environment where the streets were safer than home. Many of them had eyes hardened by pain, by the frustration of a world that never cared about them. And to make matters worse, he was a stranger, a man who came from where they feared to go, where they didn't want to go. Dylan tried to be as transparent as possible, telling his story, sharing his flaws. He didn't want to lecture or come across as someone who had all the answers. However, the skeptical young people saw him as just another empty voice. To them, he was just another adult trying to impose lessons on a world they thought they would never understand. What did he have to offer? What value did his words have when he himself had lost himself in the past? The first few weeks were difficult. Some of the young people challenged him, mocking his attempts to give them advice. Dylan quickly realized that, contrary to what he imagined, the young people weren't there seeking guidance, but rather a way to escape a painful reality. They were in a system that treated them like numbers, like problems to be solved, not as human beings in need of opportunities, understanding, and above all, someone who truly saw them. In his first attempts to talk about the mistakes he'd made and how he'd tried to change, the answers weren't nearly what he expected. One of the boys, named Marcos, stood up during one of the sessions and, with a bitter smile, asked, "Are you saying you can help us? And why do you think we can believe you? What good have you ever done in your life besides going to jail?" Marcos's words were like a blow to Dylan. He wanted to say something, but at that moment, he didn't even know where to begin. After all, what could he offer? The pain and regrets were real, but would that be enough to change the mind of someone already deeply distrustful of the world? The confrontation was constant. Dylan could no longer be the man who used force or imposition to gain respect, no longer the leader of a gang, nor someone with an army of followers. Now he had to deal with the true complexity of broken souls, with young people who, like him, were lost, but in a completely different way. He didn't have all the answers, and perhaps he didn't even know how to truly help them. That environment was very different from prison, where mistakes were punished. With more mistakes. But there he began to understand that his mission wouldn't just be to talk about the importance of not making the same mistakes. It would be much more than that. He would need to earn their trust, restore something they had already lost, their belief in themselves. And that wouldn't be easy. One afternoon, after another frustrating confrontation with one of the young men, Dylan had an idea. He began to change his approach. Instead of simply recounting what he had experienced, he began to listen more, to understand the stories of the boys and girls there. He realized that each of them had a reason for being there, and that their mistakes and choices were more a reflection of a broken system than of their own nature. They weren't simply problems to be fixed. They were human beings, with crushed dreams, with hopes that could still be rekindled if only someone would truly listen. That's when Dylan began to shift his focus. He no longer wanted to impose his lessons, but to become part of their process, someone they could count on, even if it was just a small part of their journey. He began acting more like a mentor than an instructor. He made a point of showing, through actions and words, that he was truly there to help them find a way out, not over their mistakes, but alongside them, with compassion and patience. The results weren't instantaneous, but little by little, he began to see small changes. Marcos, the young man who had challenged him, began to open up. More, sharing his frustrations. Another young woman, Anna, who had been walled off in silence, finally spoke a word during a session, and that one word was a huge breakthrough. As time passed, the young people's initial resistance diminished, though it never completely disappeared. They began to realize that Dylan was no longer a man full of empty promises, but someone who knew pain, who knew loneliness, who knew what it was like to feel lost. With each step Dylan took, he felt their confidence return, not just their confidence, but also their confidence in himself. He was there to change, but also to help them realize that the scars of the past didn't have to determine the future. And that was the most important fight. Because in the end, the greatest challenge of all would be making these young people believe that, like him, they too could break free from the invisible chains that held them captive. Dylan's work was just beginning. As the days passed, Dylan began to understand that, more than being a mentor, he needed to be someone the young people could trust. In the beginning, his relationship with them was constantly tested. They were accustomed to broken promises, to false hopes. Many of them had already been let down by life, by family, friends, and the system itself. When Dylan arrived, his ex-convict history meant nothing more than another statistic of failure to them. To earn the young people's trust, he knew he needed to go beyond words. He needed to show, through actions, that he wasn't there just to offer advice, but to walk alongside them every step of the way. That's when he began to change his approach. Dylan didn't approach the young people with the goal of being a teacher, someone who talked and expected to be heard. He began approaching them differently, more humanly, more authentically. He decided to be vulnerable. He knew that to create a true connection, he needed to show himself as he truly was. A man with flaws, with regrets, but also with a sincere desire to change and help. He began to share more of his own story genuinely, without filters or secrets, talking about the difficult moments of his life in prison, the bad decisions he'd made, the pain he felt at losing precious years. All of this made the young people see him differently. They saw that he wasn't there to judge, but to offer something real, something they'd never experienced, a second chance. The first step was to establish a dialogue. Dylan began asking questions, not to impose lessons, but to understand what each of these young people carried within themselves. He knew that the biggest obstacle wasn't a lack of information or advice, but the lack of someone who would truly listen. Little by little, he broke down the barrier of skepticism. When Marcos, the most rebellious young man in the group, began answering their questions more sincerely, Dylan saw a light at the end of the tunnel. But this trust didn't come immediately. It was earned step by step, gesture by gesture. He understood that to earn their trust, he needed to demonstrate consistency and patience, something the system itself had never offered these young people. One of his most impactful approaches was taking young people out of the traditional classroom and bringing them into reality. Instead of talking about theory, Dylan began teaching from a practical perspective, using examples from his own life. He took the young people outside into real conversations, in environments where they could express themselves without fear of judgment. One day, after a group activity, he took them to a soccer field, one of the places he hated most when he was incarcerated, but which now could be a symbol of freedom and growth. He challenged them to do something they never imagined: work as a team, support each other, let go of their ego and distrust. Most importantly, he challenged them to forgive themselves, to not carry past mistakes as a burden, but as a lesson to move forward. The results were astonishing. Over time, Dylan noticed that by offering them a safe space to fail and try again, they began to open up. He wasn't trying to change their lives all at once, but to help them realize that every small step in the right direction counted. He shared what he'd learned from his own journey of redemption, always making it clear that, just as he had failed, they too had the chance to rebuild. Most powerful of all, he wasn't just talking about the importance of change. He was living it every day with them. Trust wasn't built overnight, but the first signs that things were changing began to appear. Marcos, the young man who initially didn't want to hear a word from Dylan, began participating in the activities with more enthusiasm. Anna, who previously preferred to keep her distance, now talked more during group sessions, beginning to express her own dreams and fears. Dylan wasn't imposing anything. He was simply offering a mirror, a space where the young people could see themselves and recognize themselves as something more than what the system wanted them to be. Numbers on a failure report. Dylan's method was simple yet powerful. Empathy, patience, and above all, authenticity. He knew he didn't have all the answers, but what he offered was something many of them had never experienced. Someone willing to walk alongside them, without rushing, without judgment, without unrealistic expectations. He wasn't there to be a savior, but to be an example that, even with a dark past, change was possible, and it began within each of them. It was this environment of mutual trust that led the young people to begin to trust not only Dylan, but also themselves. They began to believe, for the first time, that they could change their stories, that they were not defined by the circumstances that had shaped them thus far. They began to realize that forgiveness was not something that came from outside, but something that needed to be given by themselves. And, more than anything, they began to see in Dylan a reflection of what could be possible for them. Dylan's journey as a mentor was just beginning, but he could already see in his eyes that he was making a difference. Maybe not in a grand way, maybe not for everyone, but for those willing to walk alongside him. He was living proof that even when life seemed to throw a stumbling block in the way, there was always a chance to find a way out, despite all the external changes, despite the small victories with the young people and the new opportunity he was creating for himself. Inside Dylan, there was still a storm raging. The freedom he had achieved was not only a release from prison, but also an attempt to escape the demons that haunted him. Every suspicious look, every judgmental word, every mistake made by the young people he was trying to help were painful reminders of what he once was. And though he had come a long way since those dark days in prison, he still carried the scars of the past within him. Dylan's inner struggle wasn't visible to others. To them, he was the mentor, the voice of experience, the one who had overcome the worst, and was now there to light the path for others. But while his students were focused on their journey of transformation, Dylan found himself fighting a silent, never-ending war. He knew the young people were seeing him as an example of change, but deep down, he still didn't feel completely free. He still saw himself as that lost man, the one who made bad choices, the one who destroyed lives with the arrogance of someone who knew no remorse. He constantly questioned whether he truly deserved to be the mentor he was striving to be. Every time he heard a young person say, "I'm not good enough," a deep ache formed in his chest. He knew what it was like to feel inferior, what it was like to think there was no hope left. What he wanted to say to these young people was simple: you can change. But words weren't always enough. And when he saw some of them starting to pull away, losing the trust he'd tried so hard to earn, the weight of his own guilt returned with full force. He silently wondered if he was truly helping, or if he was somehow just deceiving everyone, trying to save others so he wouldn't have to face his own shadows. And these shadows weren't there only in moments of weakness. They accompanied him constantly. When night fell, and he found himself alone, the echoes of his own voice in the mirror were cruel. He thought of all the friends he'd lost, the people he'd betrayed, the family he'd destroyed with his choices. He thought of the crimes he'd committed, the victims whose lives he'd ruined, and the empty stares he'd left behind. These memories wouldn't go away, and the nights were too long to hide from them. It was as if his mind would never leave him alone, always returning to those moments of regret. Even with the small victories at the reintegration center, the words of encouragement he gave the young people and the tentative steps of confidence he began to see in them, doubt still hung over him like a cloud. Am I really capable of changing? It was a question he couldn't definitively answer. He felt like he was still suspended between two worlds, that of the man who wanted to make amends, and that of the man who knew that, no matter how hard he tried, he could never erase what he had done. Dylan tried to convince himself that his past should no longer define his future, but the truth was, he still struggled to forgive himself. And this forgiveness wouldn't come just from others, but from himself. He knew that to continue helping young people, to continue being the mentor they saw in him, he would first need to accept that his journey to redemption wouldn't be a straight line, but a road full of ups and downs, where he would have to confront his own limits and embrace his humanity. The mornings were the worst. When the day began and he looked at the young people arriving for activities, the pressure was immense. He couldn't fail them, couldn't be an example of failure. But often, he found himself questioning whether he could sustain the role of mentor. He feared being their disappointment, feared that one day they would discover that, despite all the transformation he tried to convey, he was still struggling against the chains of his own past. The pressure to be perfect, to be someone who inspired confidence, left him exhausted. He wanted to be everything these young people needed. But sometimes he felt his own emotional baggage was getting in the way of truly helping them. But there was something deeper in his struggle, something he slowly began to understand. The real battle wasn't against the past, not against the scars he carried. The battle was not allowing fear and shame to dominate him, not allowing yesterday's mistakes to define him forever. Dylan began to realize that the key to overcoming this internal struggle was accepting that he would never be perfect. He could never erase what he had done, but he could learn to live with it. True redemption wasn't about erasing flaws, but about accepting them and using them as fuel for something greater. It was at this point that Dylan began taking more concrete steps toward his own healing. He sought help, talked to other mentors, and even therapists, seeking tools to deal with his own trauma. He knew he couldn't continue helping others without first learning to deal with the wounds he still carried. And, little by little, the conversations became easier, the fears more manageable. He began to understand that there was no shame in seeking help, that there was no fault in not having all the answers. True strength lay in acknowledging your weaknesses and moving forward anyway. Still, the struggle continued. It wouldn't dissipate once and for all. But Dylan now knew that his journey to redemption wouldn't be a straight line, and that it was okay to fail sometimes, because each mistake was actually a step closer to true freedom. He still had much to learn about himself and about life, but he knew that as long as he was willing to keep going, There was always a chance to start over. Among all the young men Dylan shadowed, there was one in particular who began to occupy his thoughts in a disturbing way. Gabriel was one of the quietest, someone who initially proved difficult to read. But Dylan had sensed something in him from the start. A distant look in his eyes, as if the young man were constantly struggling with something he couldn't understand or control. Gabriel was intelligent, full of potential, but at the same time, he was constantly surrounded by bad choices, negative influences, and a history marked by pain and abandonment. Dylan knew the boy was on the brink of a potentially fatal choice, the same choice he himself had made years before. Over the past few weeks, Gabriel's behavior had begun to change. Once engaged in activities, he was now more distant, more irritable. He was withdrawing from group sessions, making jokes about how life wasn't worth it, and even starting to engage with people from his past. Those Dylan knew were a danger to him. Dylan tried to talk to Gabriel several times, but the young man seemed increasingly withdrawn, as if an invisible wall separated him from the rest of the world, and he refused to see the help that was all around him. Dylan knew from experience that this distance was a symptom of something deeper, an internal battle the boy was trying to fight alone. But what bothered Dylan most was the feeling that he was somehow becoming irrelevant in Gabriel's life. One afternoon, Dylan received word that Gabriel had been seen on one of the city's most dangerous corners, surrounded by old acquaintances involved in drug trafficking and violence. Something inside him snapped. He knew exactly where Gabriel was going, the path he was about to take, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to lose this young man. It was like reliving his own story, but this time with an even greater tragedy. The feeling of helplessness in the face of a life that was falling apart before his eyes. Deep down, Dylan knew that choice wasn't just Gabriel's. It was everywhere. He'd already made that choice, had already stood on that dark corner, faced with people pushing him toward the abyss. He knew there was no way to force someone to change, but he also knew he couldn't simply stand idly by and watch. Gabriel followed the same path he'd already walked, riddled with regret and scars. That choice could mean the difference between life and death, between a future of resilience and a prison, physical or emotional, from which the young men could never escape. Dylan decided to act. He knew the confrontation wouldn't be easy. If Gabriel was already so entangled in his past, the last thing he wanted to hear was an ex-con trying to give him advice on what to do. Dylan remembered how he himself reacted to any attempt at salvation, but something in his heart told him he had to try, that he couldn't allow Gabriel to be swallowed by the darkness. Even if words weren't enough, he still had a chance to make a difference. That night, Dylan went to the neighborhood where Gabriel had been seen, and when he found the young man, what he saw was no longer the boy he'd chatted with in the activity room. Gabriel was with his friends, laughing hollowly, as if trying to convince himself he was on the right path. When he saw Dylan, the boy didn't hide his discomfort. He looked at him with a mixture of disdain and shame, as if trying to deny that, somewhere inside him, there was still the will to move forward, to fight for something better. Dylan approached, trying to remain calm, feeling the weight of the situation on his chest. He didn't know how to speak at that moment, but he knew he couldn't just stay silent. "Gabriel, I know what you're doing," he said, his voice low but firm. "I know you're with these people, and I know what they represent. You've been through things that I know are painful, but I'm here to show you another option. It doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to lose yourself again." Gabriel gave a dry, humorless laugh and looked at Dylan as if he were a stranger. "You think I'm like you? You really think I'm going to fall for this redemption and transformation thing? I'm smarter than that, man. I know where I stand, and I know what I'm doing." Dylan felt anger and frustration rising inside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I know you think you have it all under control, but I thought I did too. Trust me, you're not in control. The path you're on is irreversible. I've been there. I've lived it." Gabriel stared at him for a moment, and something in his eyes softened, but was quickly replaced by a look of defiance. He wanted to believe, but he didn't know how, and Dylan saw it. He wasn't dealing with an arrogant or rebellious young man, but with someone who was afraid of being left behind, afraid of surrendering to change, and above all, afraid of failure. Dylan took a step closer, more vulnerable than ever, and said, "I won't let you go through this alone. I've been where you are now, and I know what it's like to feel lost. But I'm here, trying to show you that, just like me, you can get through this too. Not for me, but for you." Silence fell between them, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Gabriel said nothing, but Dylan sensed that in that instant, he had touched something deep inside the young man. Not an immediate change, but perhaps the seed of a doubt, something that could grow. Deep down, Dylan knew he couldn't make Gabriel's choice. He couldn't save anyone from themselves, but the only thing he could do was stay there, trying to make a difference. He had already failed once, but now he couldn't fail again. He couldn't lose anyone else to the darkness. Gabriel's future was still unwritten, but Dylan held out hope that, for the first time, he could truly be part of this redemption story. The clock seemed to stand still as Dylan waited. The sound of his breathing was the only sound he could hear, but in his mind, a whirlwind of thoughts mingled with doubt and hope. Gabriel, after that difficult conversation, had withdrawn again. The following days were like an agonizing wait. Dylan knew that, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't control Gabriel's choices. But he couldn't give up. Not this time. He couldn't allow that boy to follow the same fate he'd seen so many times before. Because now, for the first time in a long time, Dylan believed that true victory lay not in saving others, but in being the light that showed them that the path to change was still possible. And then, the unexpected happened. That night, as the city lights began to fade, Gabriel appeared at the center's door, his eyes filled with something Dylan had never seen before. Regret. It wasn't the typical resistance he'd seen before, nor the look of a lost youth, but something different, something closer to surrender, as if he finally understood that the fight against himself was greater than any external obstacle. "I don't know what to do, Dylan." Gabriel's voice was shaking, but it was genuine. I can't do this alone." Dylan looked into Gabriel's eyes, and for the first time, he saw the boy not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone with the power to change his own life. That moment was a reflection of everything Dylan had been through, everything he had overcome. And in that instant, he knew the turning point wasn't about saving Gabriel. It was about understanding that, by saving that young man, he was ultimately saving himself. The night was marked by a profound conversation, where Gabriel finally opened up, talking about his fears, his story, and, most importantly, the weight of the choice he was about to make. He revealed that behind the facade of indifference lay a soul, haunted by the pain of not being enough, of never having felt that anyone truly believed in him. And that's what Dylan did. He believed. He believed where others had given up. He gave Gabriel not only a chance to start over, but the chance to understand that the pain of the past didn't define the future. In the days that followed, the changes in Gabriel began to become visible. He re-engaged in activities, left behind the circle of people who kept him from his own dreams, and began working on his own transformation. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, but the difference was now clear. Gabriel was beginning to believe in his own strength, and Dylan, observing all this, saw himself reflected in that young man. He saw the possibility of a new beginning, of a journey defined not by failure, but by the courage to try again. This victory wasn't just Gabriel's, it was Dylan's. He finally understood that redemption wasn't something achieved all at once, but something earned day by day. It was the acceptance that mistakes are part of the journey, but that doesn't mean the end has come. Dylan was no longer the man who had failed, but someone who now understood the true meaning of overcoming. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he had the power to change the present. and with it, the future. Dylan stood, looking at Gabriel, now with a new flame in his eyes, and felt that his work was still far from over. The path to redemption had no endpoint, but in that moment, Dylan knew that, at least for now, he had accomplished his mission. He had touched a life, and in doing so, touched his own. And so, with a lighter heart and a soul at peace, Dylan smiled, feeling freer than ever. If you were moved by this story of redemption and transformation, leave your like and subscribe to the channels, so you don't miss any more stories like this. Remember, we all have the power to change, and every step in the right direction is a victory. If you're going through a difficult time, know that change is possible, and you're not alone. Let's join us on this journey of overcoming